Right, everybody. Where we last left off, we were talking about exclusions for Part C. So now I want to transition and talk about Part D. Before we do that, I think it makes sense to go ahead and take just a little bit of time to remind ourselves what the different parts in the auto policy look like. This is something that normally when I'm teaching on campus in class, I'll do this every day of the auto unit, where we'll come in every day. The first thing I do is I write this down. So Part A, see if you quiz yourself, see if you can make this outline yourself. This is liability coverage. This is the only coverage that's required. In 49 out of 50 states, you got to have liability coverage. More about that when we talk about auto insurance in society. So this is the required part. There's plenty of people driving their vehicle and all they have is liability coverage. But if you get a standard personal auto policy, there will be other parts included. Part B will be in there. Remember, this is medical payments. So this is not medical payments to others. This is a first-party coverage. This is worth writing down. It could also be a third-party coverage because it covers passengers in my vehicle. So if somebody gets hurt while they're in my vehicle, if I get hurt, I get medical payments coverage. If they get hurt, they're entitled to medical payments coverage. It's just that the limits here are usually pretty low. Liability, on the other hand, that's always a third-party coverage, right? I can't be liable to myself. Liability never pays me. That's not what it's intended for. So Part B, low limits, a lot of times $1,000 a person, maybe as high as $10,000 a person, but you can imagine if somebody's seriously hurt, this isn't going to do it. Then we have Part C, that's uninsured motorist. It covers the same people as Part B does. It covers me in any vehicle, and it covers passengers in my car. So yeah, in that sense, it's both a first and a third party coverage. What we haven't talked about yet is Part D. That's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. This is damage to your auto. So to my auto, the way I've been referring to it. We got two different pieces here. We've got collision, and we've got other than collision. So collision, we're going to find out how we define that pretty soon, but there's things that are not collisions that can cause losses to my vehicle that we'd want to be able to cover. Maybe somebody steals my car. Maybe there's hail damage to my car. Those things aren't collisions. So usually what happens is people are thinking, okay, if I'm choosing what I'm going to buy, I have to buy Part A, have to buy liability. The real choice is going to come in, do I want the collision and other than collision coverages? And people usually either buy both or they buy neither. And the key is going to be how valuable is your vehicle? Can you afford to replace it out of pocket? So if you got an older vehicle only worth a couple thousand, yeah, if it's me, I'm probably not going to want to pay $400 every 6 months for collision and other than collision, right? If the car's only worth a couple thousand, I don't have to go very long before I can just save the premiums that I would have paid and use that money to buy a different vehicle. On the flip side, if I got a brand new vehicle, you better believe I'm buying collision and other than collision. What if I drive that brand new vehicle off the lot and I total it by driving it into a telephone pole? That can happen. That could be a $20,000 loss. That could be a $30,000 loss. I don't know where your taste in cars is. Maybe it's a really high loss. You know, there's cars that are selling for $50,000, $60,000 and up. I don't get it. You start using numbers like that, I'm thinking this is a house. But you can imagine if you've got a vehicle like that, that's an asset you have to protect. So unless you have a ton of money available to replace vehicles that get damaged, you need to be thinking about collision and other than collision. Where you don't is when the vehicle itself isn't very valuable. So sometimes people say, yeah, I have liability only coverage. Yeah, that means they mean that they probably didn't buy Part D. They probably were not thinking at all about Part B and Part C. So usually when people think about it, they're thinking about Part A, they have to. And then they're thinking about Part D, should I or shouldn't I? And Part B and C kind of get ignored. So that's where an agent can really help you decide if those coverages are important for you to have or not. So that's just a reminder of what our outline of coverage looks like. Now we're going to dive into Part D and look at that a little bit more closely. Okay, so let's do that. Let's talk about Part D, damage to your auto. So this is first party, right? My car gets damaged. Ideally, I'm hoping that's somebody else's fault so I can have somebody else pay for that. But there's all kinds of situations where it isn't, right? It's my fault. There's nobody to sue to recover. Or it can sometimes happen that the other person doesn't have insurance. And for bodily injury, we use uninsured motorist for that. But for Part D, that's property damage. And in most states, uninsured motorist will not cover property damage. So if you want your car to be covered, if somebody without insurance runs into you, you're going to need collision coverage for that. And then you're probably, if you're buying collision coverage, if that's worth it, it's probably also worth having other than collision. Let's go ahead and define collision. So collision is defined in the policy as the upset of a covered auto. So a single car rollover, that's a collision, even though the way we typically talk about collisions, that doesn't sound necessarily like a collision. If a car loses its equilibrium, so it doesn't have to completely overturn necessarily, loses its equilibrium, you have the upset of a covered auto, and that causes damage, we're going to call that a collision. Even though that might be a single car incident, there's nothing else involved. Or impact with another vehicle or object, that's easier to understand as collision, right? My car runs into somebody else's car. Well, if it's my fault, the damage to the other person's car is handled under my Part A liability. I am liable to the property damage I caused. The property damage I did to my own vehicle can only be covered under collision coverage. So this is an optional coverage, and it all comes down to, can you afford to replace your vehicle out of pocket or not? If you can't, then you really need to be thinking about collision and other than collision coverages. If you can, if you're Bill Gates, yeah, you don't need to worry about collision or other than collision. You damage your own car, you just buy a new one, fine. But there just aren't that many people who are in that position when we're talking about cars that have significant value. Again, if you have a car that's towards the end of its life, that's when it makes sense to think about dropping collision coverage. That premium might be higher than what it's worth. There's other things other than collisions that can cause physical damage to my vehicle. And there's some examples here. Yeah, somebody could steal my car. Well, yeah, that's not a collision. So collision coverage isn't good enough for that. These are sold separately, but it's really strange to buy one coverage and not the other. Usually people are either buying both of these or they're buying neither of them. If there's a reason to buy one of them, there's probably a reason to buy both. So flood damage is actually covered when we talk about vehicles. Remember, flood was excluded in the homeowner's policy. Well, a vehicle can be moved, and presumably you're going to move your vehicle if you know a flood is coming in. So if you get caught unaware and you do have flood damage, vehicle coverage, we can do that. With houses, you can't move them, so you're stuck. If there's going to be a flood, there's no loss prevention measures that you can take. So that's why it's excluded for buildings, but covered for vehicles. Hail damage is a real common one. Maybe a tree falls on my car, something like that. Those are all other than collision losses. Then this last one, I think, is probably the least intuitive and the hardest to understand. Contact with an animal is considered other than collision. And you say, wait a minute, you just defined collision as impact with another vehicle or object. Isn't impact with an animal, isn't that impact with an object? Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's just that we have decided that sometimes the animal hits you. That's the thought. So the animal's moving too, and it can sometimes happen where the animal actually runs into you. So contact with an animal, we're going to classify that as other than collision. I'll give you a shortcut. The only reason that matters is if you have different deductibles for collision and other than collision. And you really shouldn't, right? I mean, either you can afford the loss or you can't. The type of loss shouldn't influence your deductible level that you're taking. But for some reason, the standard is to have collision deductibles higher than other than collision. And that really doesn't make any sense. And the only place where it matters, if you have the same deductible, you don't care if they're going to call it other than collision or collision. In terms of how much money you're going to get for that loss, it won't change anything as long as the deductible is the same. If the deductibles are different, well, yes, then that'll change how much you get. So then you'd care. There's another factor that plays into this. We're going to find out that collision losses are punished more strongly in the future for future premiums than than collision losses. The thought there is you have control over collision losses. The better a driver you are, the less likely collision losses are. The worse a driver you are, the more likely collision losses are. So past collision losses influence your future premiums a lot more than other than collision losses will, because the thought is with other than collision, there isn't really an element of control that you had. These are a lot more random. right? Somebody stealing my car, that doesn't have to do with how good a driver I am, or hail damage doesn't have anything to do with that. You can see that. So collision and other than collisions, 2 coverages that we have under Part D. Okay, so we've got this last note on here, and the good news is this isn't any different than what we've already talked about. So it says coverage applies to non-owned autos as excess. Well, yeah, insurance on the vehicle is always primary. Insurance that comes from the driver is always excess. We already know that. That's the same thing. Non-owned autos, this coverage is excess, right? So yeah, if I drive my friend's car, I have collision coverage. We're going to use his first because insurance on the vehicle is primary, right? So this isn't new. This is just something that's reinforcing something we already know. So it's nice to know this if I rent a car. Well, insurance on the vehicle is primary. Rental car agencies, they don't carry insurance on their vehicles for things that happen when people are driving it. They rely on you as the driver to carry the insurance. They'll sell it to you if you don't have it. So you might be somebody who doesn't own a vehicle, so you don't have auto coverage. You go to rent a car, yeah, you don't have anything to bring with you. So they'll sell you insurance. That's what they're asking you at the rental car counter. But if you have a standard auto policy, the coverage that you have under that standard auto goes with you no matter what car you drive on an excess basis. So when you rent a car, there is no primary layer. Your excess coverage of collision will apply when you rent a car. And we'll get into that later. So if you're driving a car that you don't own, if you have collision in your policy and other than collision in your policy, those coverages will go with you. The exception is, like always, if you have a vehicle that's made available for your regular use, then that's going to be an exclusion. And we've talked about that before. So if it's a car you regularly drive, that really needs to be on a declarations page somewhere, and somebody's paying a premium on that. If it's made available to you, that means you need to make sure you're insuring it. Temporary use, no problem. Regular use is something that needs to be showing up on a declarations page. So yeah, what about rental cars? Just started that conversation. Well, they will sell you collision insurance if you want it. And again, the best situation for that is somebody who does not have an auto. There's plenty of people who live in cities, take public transportation. They don't own a car. You don't think about it in a place like Muncie, Indiana, parking. I had a friend who got, his first job in Chicago, and he was telling me he pays $800 a month for the privilege of parking his car where he works. And I was like, $800 a month, that's a rent payment. You can get an apartment in all the places I've ever lived for about that much. And he's paying that to park his car. So it's in terms of owning a vehicle in a big city, man, that's a major expense. There's a lot of people who have said, yeah, I'm going to do whatever I can to make it so I don't have to own a vehicle. Well, and I'll just rent a car when I want to go somewhere. That's fine, but you don't have any insurance. So a good place to think about buying insurance from the rental car company is, if you don't have insurance from any other source. So you buy this waiver, they call it a collision damage waiver, and it protects against damage or theft of the rental car. And if you don't buy this insurance and you don't have any other underlying insurance, then you're personally responsible for that. If you rent a car and somebody steals it, you have to pay the rental car company the fair market value of the car. And rental cars tend to be newer, so you're looking at $15,000, $20,000, $25,000. Nobody can afford to take that liability on. Rental car insurance is expensive. A lot of times the insurance costs just as much as the car rental. So it'll double your cost. But if you don't have any other insurance, it's probably something you have to think about. And that's just the collision piece. They'll also sell you supplemental liability if you have no liability insurance, and that you've got to have by law. So insurance from your policy goes with you no matter what car you drive. So you have coverage under your auto policy. And then there's a lot of credit cards out there that will provide coverage for rental cars as a benefit just to owning their credit card and putting that charge on their credit card. They will automatically cover you. Don't take my word for it, though. You got to check the fine print. Not all credit cards do this, but a lot of them do. And that's just a nice benefit to have. That's always going to be on an excess basis. If there's something underlying that covers it, then they won't pay. The problem that you're going to have there's two potential problems. One is you may have insurance from your personal policy that you're bringing with you. There's going to be a deductible if there's a collision or other than collision claim. So you'll have to pay that. So you're not completely covered. When you do a collision damage waiver, there's no deductible. So that is one thing to consider. The other thing that you have to worry about is my insurance is going to pay actual cash value. That's the most that they'll pay if I total out a rental car. Totaling out, the cost to repair is more than the car is worth, right? And that happens all the time. Driving a $15,000 car, completely destroy it. To replace it with a brand new car is going to be $20,000. The rental car company is going to want $20,000 to replace the car. My insurance is only going to pay $15,000 because it only pays the actual cash value, not the replacement cost. That gap, I'm going to have to cover out of pocket if I choose to let my own insurance provide collision coverage for me while I rent a car. So, short answer, yeah, your coverages go with you no matter what car you drive. A temporary substitute, as long as it's a temporary substitute. The only exception is if it's a vehicle that's made available for your regular use. That's why we've got that exclusion showing up everywhere. So should I buy the rental car insurance? Well, if you have collision insurance on your own policy, that's already covering you. So that's something you want to consider. If you don't have collision insurance, well, yeah, then it's not covering you when you go to buy a rental car. And then you might want to think about that. Because having to pay for these losses out of pocket is something most people can't afford. So it's tricky, though. You get up to the rental car counter and they say, oh, do you want the insurance? And everybody says, well, am I covered or not? I don't know. That's why it's important to know. If you got a standard auto policy, I know the answer is, yeah, that's going to go with you no matter what car that you drive. If you got something other than the personal auto policy, probably smart to check with your agent, make sure that's the case. So rental car is something that usually is a temporary substitute vehicle. Your insurance should cover that vehicle as your covered auto, if you remember back to the definitions that we talked about at the beginning of the unit. Exclusions in Part D. So we've seen some of these before. Cab exclusion shows up again. Again, if you're running a taxi cab business, that's a whole different exposure. You need a whole different type of insurance policy. Some of the companies have come out with policies where you can just click a box and say, yeah, I drive for Uber. And in fact, in the auto quote assignment, you'll see that. And so then they'll endorse those coverages back in. But the standard policy excludes them. So you want to know that. Tires wear out, windshield wipers wear out. Those are not insurable losses. The big losses that can happen, mechanical breakdowns, also not insurable losses. So we don't handle maintenance kinds of things. Yeah, tires, you have to replace those every so often. Nothing you can do. That's just an expense of owning a motor vehicle. That's not something you can insure against. Mechanical breakdown, you can buy an extended warranty for your vehicle, and that'll cover those sorts of things. But your car insurance policy doesn't cover mechanical breakdown. And the two big ones, of course, engine, transmission. Everything else that happens with mechanical breakdown is usually a lesser concern, although sometimes still expensive. In either case, not going to be covered by insurance. So wear and tear, mechanical breakdown, we've seen that as an exclusion before, no surprise. Insurance doesn't cover these kinds of losses. Warranty products, if you want to pay separately, you can do that. There will be a possibility to do that, and now they've got products to cover any vehicle. So if you basically want to prepay your mechanical expenses, you can do that with an extended warranty. If electronic equipment is not permanently installed, if it's not OEM, if it's not an original equipment manufacturer, if it's not part of the vehicle, then that's not covered. So whatever work you've done to put audio equipment into your car, just be aware that's not covered under Part D. You'll need to endorse that, add separate coverage if you've done anything to put in expensive audio equipment. So some people do that. No problem. That's fine. Just be aware that any work that you do, any additional stuff you add to the car, that won't be covered if your car gets damaged in an accident. This isn't so much, but for a long time here, we had tapes and discs. That's how people kept their music. I know, back in the olden days, yes. And then records in the super olden days. I've never seen a car with a turntable. Someday, maybe I will. The music media part of it was never covered. And, nowadays you think about it and you say, how could have that been really worth so much? But I remember a time, it wasn't that long ago, where when CDs were the primary method of music playing in cars, And, with CDs, if each one costs $10 and a lot of people had 200 CDs in their car. So in an auto accident, if that gets destroyed, you're thousands of dollars in music media. That's not covered. Not really the same situation today. But it is something that has always been excluded, and it's something that's always been available if that was a significant, valuable thing that you had, that you could add coverage with an endorsement there. It wasn't that long ago, I had a car that could play both cassette tapes and CDs, right? So I could put in my mixtape. You guys don't know what a mixtape is. Maybe I should make an assignment. Go Google mixtape. Go ask your parents. They'll know. So it wasn't that long ago that I just got rid of a car that had a cassette player. Good times. All right, that's a good place to pause and pick up on the next time with the next lecture. Thanks a lot, you guys. You have questions, let me know. We'll go from there. Thanks.